Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all, and welcome to our conversation on safeguarding against racism in programs. I have a couple of housekeeping notes. You will notice you have entered the meeting with your cameras off and audio muted. Please keep your audio muted to help keep background noise to a minimum. Due to the large number of expected attendees, we ask that you keep the conversation and your questions on the Pathable webpage, which we will have a chance to engage with towards the end of the session. Today's conversation will and should be uncomfortable. I invite you all to be vulnerable and open to that discomfort. That's where growth happens. This conversation actually requires discomfort, particularly for those who have long held power. Try to be aware of instinctual defensiveness and to not take things personally. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and shared post-event. The MYT team are here to help you with any technical difficulties. Please use the chat facility on here or the virtual meeting platform to ask any technical questions, or email the team at events@myt.uk.com, where the MYT team will reply to you immediately. So again, welcome and thank you to our conversation on safeguarding against racism in programs. My name is Brooke Feldman, and I serve as ADRA International's Global Safeguarding Advisor. I'm privileged to share this virtual platform with 3 others who I've really learned so much from in the process of preparing for today. We have Yemisi Songo-Williams, a Senior Advisor for Knowledge Management at ADRA International. Yemisi is a certified knowledge manager with over a decade's international experience in implementing knowledge management and organizational learning initiatives for development programs. Change slide, please. We have Nixon Nembaware, who is a gender and inclusion specialist at Mercy Corps Zimbabwe. Nixon has 12 years experience working on gender and social inclusion. His work includes promoting positive masculinities through training and advocacy and creating men's discussion forums. And we have Jennifer Eamon, Senior Advisor for Safeguarding at Oxfam America. Jennifer is a Canadian who has worked predominantly in the international aid sector with a focus on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. Before joining Oxfam America in September 2018, Jennifer worked for a number of UN agencies in Belgium, Haiti, the DRC, and Iraq. Change slide. Today's topic deserves more than the 41 minutes we have remaining, but we, admittedly not experts in this field, but professionals trying to be intentional about our positions of power, hope to add to and move forward the conversation that one of our main donors doesn't even want us to have on anti-racism and decolonizing the aid sector. But still, I'm sure you are wondering, why are we, given our roles in safeguarding and gender, even talking about racism? And our answer is the same for why we talk about and champion accountability, quality, and do no harm. We cannot emphasize enough the harm that's continued to be caused by imperialism, racism, and similar forms of discrimination based on valuing people, ideas, culture, and more, simply due to where they come from or the color of their skin. If safeguarding is about being accountable for our power and doing no harm, and ideally even promoting well-being, then we certainly have a duty to safeguard against racism. Yes, the system is flawed, but many of us are still unwilling at this point to burn it all down. Considering racism is a public health crisis, we can use a public health approach of harm reduction. We all must be incredibly intentional and try to incessantly disrupt the system where we have power. And for those working in INGOs, that's primarily in partnerships and programs. I want to share a few examples of how imperialism and racism have appeared in programs that I've heard about or worked on directly. A colleague from Zimbabwe told me about the books an NGO provided her school that taught English using fruits and vegetables from the West. She explained how this influenced her community's her community in some aspects to colonize their mindsets and how they valued more to be seen with foods like apple and broccoli instead of purchasing and eating locally grown food. This speaks to the potential harm of losing local knowledge and traditions when NGOs impose their own agendas onto communities. Relying on community volunteers to carry out full-time life-saving jobs to adhere to all of our policies and procedures, and then incentivize them with juice, crackers, and transportation vouchers. Shifting decision-making up the chain and not listening to local staff or communities, resulting in programs that never meet their objective because their solutions have Western origins, such as providing latrines that are never used by communities who have different wants and needs. Sorry, next slide. And of course, securing large budgets to hire young foreign white females, such as myself, to oversee extremely educated and more experienced nationals rather than establishing professional development systems where our programs are located. These are just a few examples, but it's difficult to fully recognize the problem of racism within programs, given how baked in imperialist and racist thinking becomes, especially while we're working in a system that's rooted in racism. That's why it's simply not enough to be not racist, but rather we must be actively anti-racist in our program design, implementation, and evaluation. Thus, today's and hopefully every day after's objective is to recognize programmatic racism and begin dismantling it by actively relinquishing our power and promoting justice and equity. We must no longer ignore the existence of imperialism and racism in our sector and in our programs. The extent of harm and damage it's caused, it's probably virtually impossible to quantify at this point. And we need to address it on every level: the system, organizations, culture, individuals, policies, and more. But today we're here to talk about how to address it in programs, where the risk of harm caused by racism is most proximal to the affected populations we are paid to support. And we must hold ourselves accountable for that. Today, we want to focus on how power sharing benefits both sides, and some concrete ways we can relinquish power and empower others, as Nixon speaks about diversity and localization, and how equity and justice can improve our missions by mainstreaming anti-racism and centering the voices of local communities throughout the program cycle with Jennifer. And Yemisi will then courageously guide us through some of your questions for what I hope is a reflective and action-oriented conversation. Thank you for coming, and without further ado, Nixon. Next slide, please.
Thank you. I will start by suggesting that all efforts that we might do in mainstreaming anti-racism and development have to be centered around a rights-based approach, where we need to realize that we're not doing anyone a favor. We are not coming in as benevolent helpers. We are not coming in as saviors, so to speak. We're not helping people or protecting people, but we are protecting the people's rights. And so whatever we are going to be doing has to be centered on rights. Everyone has a right, and those rights have to be protected without fail. That will strengthen our discussion and give us the impetus, the encouragement, and also the creativity by realizing that there are rights to be protected, and the need will be engraved in our minds in the designs and every technical effort that we do. The second thing that I want us to focus on is power sharing. Empowerment requires intention on the part of the powerful. If you realize that there are power differentials, in most cases, people expect those at the lower receiving end of the power continuum to fight for their rights. But there's another way of fighting for other people's rights by bringing them up from the lower levels, sitting with them on an equal footing on the decision-making table of program design, and talking to them with power and with respect and with dignity, and assuring them that whatever they're going to talk about, Whatever they're going to suggest is going to be taken without penalty on their side. What does that mean practically? What does that mean practically? What do we mean? How do we localize that? How does that come alive practically in the field? We need resource allocation to demonstrate commitment. Everything that is given so much resources, everyone in the field will take it seriously, and they'll give as much attention that warrants the amount of resources that's invested in that. What do we mean by resources? Do we only mean money? No. We mean also having a special dedicated staff member who's on the lookout to ensure that all forms of anti-racism are dealt with. All forms of segregation are dealt with. The decision-making system, they're dealt with. What do we mean? Do we need to invest technical resources? Yes, we need to invest a lot in research. What do we mean when we talk of funding? Much is given, much is expected. If we have a specific budget line dedicated for that, you will see the attitudes and the commitment will shift because people know that this is an important higher level commitment in terms of budgetary allocation, human resource allocation, and even time allocation. Do we have time set aside for us as organizations? When we do our annual program review meetings, do we talk about these things? Do we provide a safe and healthy platform to negotiate and talk about the power imbalances? If we invest in such resources, we will see the changes beginning to take place. We also need to take bold steps. When we take bold steps, what do we mean? We need to set targets. We are very clear on targets. If we're working on a program that's dealing with water and sanitation, we know exactly the number of boreholes that we need to have drilled at the end of the year. If we are working on anti-racism, what targets are we setting? What do we expect to see at the end of the year? How many meetings, higher level meetings of consultation are we going to record? Are we going to be having dashboard? Are we going to be having traffic light systems like we do for other innovations? That is what we now need to do to say, let's take bold steps. Qualitative measures are difficult to measure. These are behavior change, but we need to take the bold steps and start to begin to see the differences. When we think of local level examples, what does that really mean? Is it only involving the community? Is it only involving the local staff? What power do the communities have? Do we have platforms like we have done for every other project to say when we're having a program, we have a gender awareness address before we start to do anything? Are we going to be having that for anti-racism campaign? Are we going to be investing money in setting those campaigns? So localization has to have clear indicators and clear timeframes. How much are we going to be borrowing from what has happened over the years in other movements like the gender justice movement? What are we going to learn from them? And these are things that we need to see if we are going to see localization actually taking place. Next slide, please. So I think those are my talking points, and I'll leave time to Jennifer to take it forward.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jennifer Emond. I work as a senior advisor for safeguarding with Oxfam America. I've been working in the space of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid sector for a number of years. And for me, it really comes down to an issue of accountability. And having accountable, good quality programs is what will make our programs safe for people to participate, safe from sexual abuse and other forms of abuse by aid workers. I think that probably on this call, we have a number of folks who are program staff. Perhaps you work in headquarters, perhaps you work in a country office or regional office. And I think that the nature of the aid sector makes it really difficult for us to be truly accountable and to, as Nixon said, empower those we're working with to have a voice. How many of us have been guilty or put in this situation where we have a donor contact us saying, hey, by the end of the month, I need a proposal on my desk for this much money about this topic. Quick, you have 2 weeks or 1 week to pull something together. And so you copy and paste from another project that you've developed. And so I think that that's something that we all do. I think that's something that is part of our aid sector. But what does that really mean? And can that lead to racism and safeguarding concerns? Yes, it absolutely can. So I think for me, the main thing is thinking about safeguarding, accountability, and risk management throughout the entire program cycle. So what's the program cycle? The first step is the assessment phase, and then we go into planning, program design, and then we have implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation. So that is the program cycle. But throughout that, what we really need to be thinking of risk management, including in the planning phase and the assessment phase. Are we really looking at safeguarding risks, protection risks? And are we looking at those risks from a gender lens, or are we looking at them from an intersectional lens? As a safeguarding person or who focuses on sexual exploitation and abuse, I hear over and over again, safeguarding is about protecting women and girls, as if women and girls are one homogenous group. That means that we're forgetting about men and boys. We're forgetting about individuals with different backgrounds, different gender identities, different sexual preferences, different ethnicities, religion, and race. I think that's something that's really important, that we don't just consider individuals as what is their gender? Are they women and girls? So we're going to focus on them, but thinking more holistically about intersectionality and different aspects of people's lives that has an impact. So I think if we think about accountability, there is a few core principles that we really need to focus on in accountability. And the first one is transparency. So are we really being transparent about why we're there? We hear stories all the time about communities asking, can we see the project document? What are you doing here? And then we can't see the project. No, sorry, we can't share that with you, it's confidential. So how does a community member know that they have rights? They have the right not to be exploited or harassed. They have rights, have the right to complain, to provide feedback, and to actively participate. But if we're not transparent, then that means that they don't know about these rights necessarily. So we need to be transparent. We also need to ensure that we have adequate participation. And I think very often we think about, oh, we're consulting. Well, what does consulting actually mean, and who are we consulting with? Are we really quickly consulting with the one person that we already know in the community? Does that person represent the entire community, or do they represent a specific group within that community, such as the elite or politicians? Is it the mayor? Is it a member of one organization that we consult with? Or maybe we need to think more broadly about who we're consulting with and make sure that we're hitting all those different groups. Because even within a community, there may be different elements around race, ethnicity, class, religion. And so consulting with one or two people is not sufficient. So are we actually measuring who we're consulting with? Are we tracking that? Or do we just say, oh, I talked to somebody, so that's done, tick the box, right? So I think participation, consultation is really important. And then the third part around accountability is complaints and feedback. And I think this is something we talk a lot about in the safeguarding space, but also within programs. And how many of us have been guilty of putting in the box under complaints and feedback mechanisms in our project proposal? Yes, there's a complaints box that's available. And that's our indicator. Do you have a complaints and feedback mechanism? Yes, we do. Not the question of, do people know how to use it? Do people trust this complaints mechanism? So we need to think about what kind of indicators are we including in our proposals and our projects that will help us to identify if our complaints mechanisms are actually used by the community, trusted by the community, and not just the community, but those different subsections of the community. I think sometimes we have awareness raising materials, including posters about, here, call this hotline. I think all of us INGOs are guilty of this. With Oxfam, we use Ethics Point. And there's some that think that, oh, well, having this phone number is sufficient. And I can't think of any community members who have called this hotline. Some of the posters include maybe visuals that don't represent every part of society. So you have to be really careful about the posters and the visuals that we're doing to make sure that they're inclusive. So I've seen in certain locations where we're really targeting certain groups, and then others, like refugees, for example, think, oh, this doesn't apply to us because we don't see ourselves in this picture. So I think that's something that we really have to think about in our programming, and make sure that we're setting ourselves specific indicators and budget, as Nixon said, to make sure that these become really key parts of our programs and our proposals. And I think particularly around project development, I know that we do have quite a rush often to do proposals really quickly. Oftentimes it's people at headquarters level who have to draft something really quickly. But if that's the case and you don't have time to adequately consult with the community around the project design, around awareness raising materials, you have to add that into the project design. So you should have consultation period, budget to go with that, and specific indicators that really allow us to measure, who are we talking to? Who are we consulting with? Is it just one person who we assume speaks for the entire community? Or are we really targeting these different groups to make sure that the project and our activities and our awareness raising and our complaints and feedback mechanisms are appropriate and accessible to everybody? And can we identify where certain gaps are that we need to target? So I think that's enough for now. I think I'm at my 10 minutes. So back to you, Brooke.
Thank you guys so much. That was really interesting to hear you guys put all of your thoughts together after the several weeks we've been discussing this topic and all of its facets. Next slide, please. So we're going to start our Q&A now, which is nice. We have plenty of time for this conversation, but I'm going to start it off with some questions I have for you both, and then Yemisi will take over. So Nixon, I was really excited you mentioned the gender justice movement, because today's session is not the first conversation to be talking about racism or decolonizing development. And one of the sort of the takeaways I've heard from other conversations have been mainstream anti-racism, like we've mainstreamed gender. So as a gender specialist, I ask you, what can the sector learn from or build on as we try to mainstream anti-racism based on your work in mainstreaming gender and gender justice movement, so we can be transformative in our actions?
One of the strongest attributes of the gender justice movement is their tenacity and never giving up. Both at design level and at community level, the mobilization did not happen overnight. It's been decades and decades of fighting for gender justice. And if we are going to achieve sensible progress in anti-racism, we just need not give up. We need to count every step, but also ensure that the journey that lies ahead is going to be long, and we need to be prepared for it. We are going to face resistance, and we are going to be branded all sorts of names. If we are to make any progress, we need not give up. Number two, it's going to be research. Research, 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 and research. There have been a lot of models, a lot of frameworks, a lot of methodology studies that have been put in place for us to now achieve the progress that we're now commending in terms of gender equality, gender justice. The terminology has evolved over time. There was a time when there was no consensus in what sort of dictionary we are going to use for the gender justice movement. If we're going to achieve success in anti-racism, we need also to invest a lot in research, invest a lot in discovering methodologies that work appreciating them up until a certain time, and leaving them for better and newer technologies and methods that we are going to adopt. The other one is continuously raising awareness, fitting it in where people think it cannot be fitted in, fitting it in even where people are not willing to accept it, negotiating the space, negotiating and adopting all kinds of methods, sometimes from a higher level, sometimes from the side level, sometimes even from below, and negotiating without stopping. I think these are one of the greatest lessons that I have learned from the gender justice movement. Even if we appreciate it now, you know that those working on gender, you know that group and everyone else working in this room working on that will tell you that people working on gender justice are not giving up. They are finding newer methods every day, and they are continually investing in research. We are not there yet. We know nothing. Let's not give up.
Thanks. That gives me some faith in a time when I don't have a lot of hope. I liked your point, and I want to raise it on what is the language we're going to use. Jennifer and I have had a similar discussion, as we are both have safeguarding in our title, and probably nobody more than Oxfam knows the push around safeguarding in the past couple years, but how limiting, or how even this term safeguarding, given its British roots, has influenced the way that we've approached safeguarding and PSEA now. So you could share a bit about how you've seen just the language alone shape our work.
I think the language is slightly problematic. I think safeguarding means a lot of things, and it means nothing at the same time. I saw my job advertisement over 2 years ago, and it said senior advisor for safeguarding, and I had to Google it. I was like, what is that? I think in the sector, a lot of folks were using the term PSEA, protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. So we get also sucked into this acronym obsession that we have in the sector. But I think part of the problem I see with safeguarding in particular is that all of a sudden, all these jobs started popping up: safeguarding advisor, safeguarding officer, safeguarding manager. And who has safeguarding in their work experience in the past? It's British folks. And I think that that has probably led to hiring a lot of new safeguarding officers, which is great, and a lot of people are great, but they're largely British or people who have worked in the UK space in the past. And I think that this can be a deterrent for hiring individuals from different countries and different contexts where maybe they don't have the term safeguarding in their background, in their CV. So I think that it's really important that we think more carefully about the term, and that especially when we're using it in our trainings and talking with our partners and our communities, that we don't use this language that's so official, but we just talk about the concepts. So we want to talk about safety, do no harm, about accountability, and not like PSEA, safeguarding. And even when I do trainings in French, there's no translation for safeguarding. So I say safeguarding in French with an accent. So I think that it's really important that we're really talking about the concepts and what we mean, and not focusing so much on the term. And I think in recruitment practices as well, we have to be really careful that we're not screening out people just because they don't have the term safeguarding in their past work experience.
Thanks. And Nixon, as we talk about sort of things that come from the UK or where the money is coming from, to localizing things, because that's actually where we're doing the work. I mean, the argument and the push for localization isn't new, and we've heard a lot of excuses. We don't have the budget, complex donor reporting, we don't have the time. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you think that your counterparts in the global north, perhaps the majority of people sitting in on this call, aren't getting, or they don't understand, or they're not hearing?
I think what we're not getting here is that the way we design our programs and the way we deliver them has an effect on how the people in the southern recipient communities receive them. if the programs are designed for you, delivered to you, and evaluated on you without you particularly taking an active part that is really mainstreamed from the start to the end, you become a passive recipient of development. That has a bearing on sustainability. That has a bearing on your level of participation. People end up participating practically. So I've seen this in my experience, where people are playing along and not questioning things they should question for fear of losing the funding. But what I will always say is, the way it's crafted and it's important, people are told that this is your right. It's inalienable, it's yours, and yours never to be taken away. They will come in onto the design table, the implementation table, and the evaluation table of the programs as active partners. So like what we're talking about, the change in the language from a donor to a beneficiary community, that differential alone saying it's different from saying a funding partner and a development partner. That alone will change the language. And if people get that to say, when we develop our projects, when we have models researched elsewhere, can we run through them and fact check them with the communities, with even other researchers of like-mindedness and the same stature from local universities, who we trust and we believe they know the settings that they are working with better, and perhaps equally as we do and fact check the work that we are doing. That, I think, will be transforming in the way we approach things.
I hope everybody heard that and took notes. So we've been getting some questions through the Zoom chat, and I'll hand it over to Yemisi to help us guide us through those. But I do encourage you all to use the CHS Exchange website, as that records our conversation and the Zoom doesn't. Yemisi?
Great. Thank you, Brooke and Nixon and Jennifer, for getting this conversation started. As an outsider to this kind of work, this is the fun part for me. This is where I get to hear not only the questions that you guys still have around this, but also the insights and the experiences that you have from working in this. So as we go through the questions, please feel totally free to also send in, experiences that you have that others might find useful as we all try and work towards safeguarding against racism in the programs that we implement. So I'll start you guys off with a pretty easy one. Does induction training at any of your organizations include these topics? Who wants to take that?
Okay, I'll chime in. What I've realized.
Oh, I went on mute.
Okay, all right. It's a topic that's scattered around. There's no active. We now have guidelines on sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. The guidelines are there, they are clear. But in most organizations, at least in my country, in Zimbabwe, there is no anti-racism clause even when you join the organization, when you sign your contract. It's just vaguely says against all forms of abuse. And I usually like to call them isms, racism, sexism, tribalism, but there is no direct that. And I think that's a good indicator where we can boldly start to have such clauses and people talk about that openly. It gives us a warning, but also opens a discussion.
Thank you, Nixon. Jennifer, would you say it's a similar situation at Oxfam?
Yeah, I would say it's similar. We definitely have a code of conduct, as Nixon said, that does talk about the different isms, but I think that we could do a better job. And I think we're starting to explore that now and realizing with these conversations over the last few months that we need to do better, we need to do more. So we're exploring that with different groups within the organization around how to strengthen that and trying to get outside expertise as well in terms of, how to have these conversations and how to facilitate, because it's difficult to facilitate these conversations. And if you don't have the right person doing it, it can go really wrong. So I think we're on our journey there, and it's something we need to look at for sure.
Okay. Andres makes a comment that it's a great point that it's not enough to be non-racist, but we have to be actively anti-racist as well, which I wanted to highlight. And then he asked the question, how do you work with resistance? Jennifer, you've just said, you know, when we all know this is a sensitive topic, this is an uncomfortable conversation to have. So how do you work with resistance? Especially when a lot of the advice that you hear is don't be confrontational, when we know it's a political discussion, when we know it's a power-related discussion, when we know it's uncomfortable. How do you push through with people's resistance? I'm gonna pick on you, Brooke, and then ask the other two as well.
No, Jennifer unmuted first. How do you push through? I think setting the conversation and bringing it back to what we're here to do. What is the mission or our objective? And when we think of, as Nixon said, protecting rights and not people. And for me, it's not a political argument. We say in our policies, don't discriminate. And if we're discriminating based on race and background, then that's a form of discrimination. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but I would remind people that these conversations should be uncomfortable. As I said, that's where the growth happens. And because we haven't been able to point out our power imbalances and people are unwilling to relinquish power, or maybe scared to have conversations, to remind everybody that it's their responsibility to be accountable for that if they're going to work in this sector, and it's part of their missions, and it should be part of their value systems. So I don't really have a great answer other than, as Nixon said, it's a long journey, stick to it. And I asked myself a lot, like, why am I here having this conversation? And I just kept coming back to why not? We should all be here. And we're going to stumble, but at least, or hopefully we're stumbling in the right direction.
Yes. Jennifer, anything to add or qualify?
I think it's a tricky one, because on the one hand, we need to push and we need to make people feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, we can't push in a way that maybe alienates and then people just shut down the conversations. I've seen that happen as well in the sexual exploitation and abuse discussions as well. So I think that one size does not fit all. Also for the race discussion around race in the United States is going to look different than discussion elsewhere, for example. So I think that while it's important to push, I think it's also important to listen and to kind of try to engage people and take baby steps. And we can't go from 1 to 100 tomorrow or overnight. I think that for certain audiences, of course, it's going to take a little bit more time. And I think we see the same issue when we're talking about LGBTQI rights in some countries where it's illegal. So to have this like push that we must do X, Y, and Z, it's not going to have the same effect as when we're talking about those issues in different countries too. So I think that there's not a one size fits all approach to it, but definitely we have to keep pushing, and baby steps is important.
One other thing I want to add is when we focus on the discomfort or people getting defensive, it's sort of it's a form of white centering. That's not the point of the conversation, your discomfort, or that you're like, oh, this is too political. That's not the point of the conversation. So just to keep centering it about what the issue is actually about.
Thank you. Rosa points out we need meal indicators to track these things, but we also need different stories. Do you have any concrete ideas about how to effectively counter the white savior narrative? Who's going to be brave enough to start us off on that?
I agree that we need indicators, and our indicators have to be at different levels. both process, both output and outcome indicators at all those levels, and also setting them up realistically, just like we do for every other indicator, every other indicator basket that we might use. The ideas of how we are going to have concrete ideas, I might not have the best ideas because it depends on the situation and where the setting is coming from. If you're talking of the situation in Zimbabwe, someone would obviously want to start that conversation from colonialism. If you're starting that conversation in South Africa, someone would want to start from apartheid. If you're having it in Asia, if you're having it in North America, it will take a different form and shape. And so it has to be situational and not having a blanket cover of indicators across the board, but indicators that speak to the specific realities, number one, of the community you're working with, number two, of the historical issues around that community, and number three, of the conversations that have already taken place. If diversity is already an issue, then you need to push the boundaries to move beyond diversity to actual transformational inclusion. So I think it takes different shapes and forms depending on the situation and the setting.
It also go back to mainstreaming the local voice throughout the program cycle. So it's asking communities how they want to measure impact and how they want to measure success, and not using the indicators that just the donors or us at regional and headquarters. Because, you know, if we're the people with the white savior complex, we're not going to be able to understand how to track progress or measure our own diminishing white saviorism. It's going to be locally named.
And I think if we think about empowerment, we talk a lot, every single project proposal I read talks about empowering the local community, but there's no indicators about empowerment, because how do you even measure that without having the community tell you themselves what would make them feel empowered? So I think if we think about in the program cycle where and who we've been consulting with and how involved community members have been, how much feedback we're getting through feedback and complaint mechanisms. So I think if we have indicators to track that, that can really tell us that we are making an effort to engage more with the community and make sure that the programs are appropriate and we're accountable. And that can break down those power barriers and power dynamics where we have, you know, we're coming in, people are too afraid to tell us that your project sucks because they're worried that we're going to take away all of our funding and support, right? So I think if we're thinking really carefully about how we integrate these indicators into our monitoring and evaluation framework, in particular focusing on community participation and which groups and who we're talking to and who we're consulting with.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and also for those practical kind of illustrations of indicators, because I think that was a question that someone asks further down. I would like to there it is. So there's an interesting question by Kayen. I hope I've said that correctly, that I'd like each of you to address in turn, please, as we try and wrap up. On the topic of language and power, do you have thoughts on the terms being used? Example, white savior, white fragility. Do they enable or inhibit these difficult conversations internally? So I'd really like you to frame your responses in terms of your organizational context, your programming context, and share some of those thoughts with us. Who'd like to go first? On the topic of language and power, do terms like white savior, white fragility enable or inhibit these conversations?
I would agree that language has to be chosen very carefully, and linking it to what Andre also said earlier on, our language will either facilitate change or facilitate resistance. sometimes coming in from an angle where you're already branding someone, you're coming in from this angle, might also be an inhibitor. But we need also not to shy away from existence of such things and such mentality and how the communities feel about that. So it's a process of framing the language from both sides, from those with power and those without power. It does not have to be either of the sides framing the language. We have to build the language up together, change it as we go, realizing that sometimes it was worthwhile up until this point, but we are moving on. So the language, I agree, at times it inhibits and blocks the conversation that we are trying to kind of strike and perpetuate.
Brooke or Jennifer? Brooke, go ahead.
Yeah, similar sentiments to Nixon. I think getting to the root of the terms, maybe rather than getting stuck on the terms. Sometimes if we say just white savior, we lose this like the diversity of actually people who are white saviors. There are not just white people working in INGOs in Europe and the South Pacific and the US, but we are diverse, and our own backgrounds bring own biases and our own discriminations in the work we do. So yeah, I don't think there's a cookie cutter answer, but just to be sure we're using inclusive language. And I also think about terms and my own journey of understanding these concepts and applying them in my life of behavior change as we go from pre-contemplation to contemplation to change, and sort of becoming familiar with the terms white savior and white fragility and being like, oh, that's not me, and like, oh, that's me, and now what am I going to do about it? So even if it inhibits these conversations today, it might lead to change and growth down the line.
Thanks, Brooke. And Anna shared a really interesting article about that, how white people conquered the nonprofit sector, which I'll call your attention to in the chat. And she also says, and I'll wrap up with that before I punt it over to you, Brooke. She says, I think the key here is the concrete steps and actions for change, not stopping at the level of having a conversation. Something for all of us to think through and walk towards. Thank you, guys. Over to you, Brooke.
Thanks, Yamasi, so much. And thank you all, particularly to our panelists, for attending and participating in this conversation on how we can safeguard against racism in programs. I hope this begins a broader conversation on racism in our sector that you're actually able to have with local staff and affected populations, so that they too have a chance to provide their perspective of the problem and possible solutions. Additionally, I task you all with writing down one thing you're going to do to take forward from something you've learned here today. And thanks again. I hope to have many conversations, but also many actions like this with you all in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Brooke and team.